If you have your Bibles now, would you turn to Hebrews chapter 11? In Hebrews chapter 11, we know that this is the faith chapter. It's the hall of fame, the listing of those that have gone before us, that great cloud of witnesses. We know all of us have faith, but the question is, where are we putting our faith? Think about when you get sick and you go to urgent care. You go see a doctor that probably you've never met, and maybe you can't even pronounce his name. And then he gives you a prescription that oftentimes you can't read because it's a scribble. And then you take it to a pharmacy, and you give it to the pharmacist, who probably you've never met or had a conversation with. Maybe you have. But then he fills the medication, and he gives it to you. And you don't know if this new medication is going to affect you personally. I mean, there's some side effects that are listed, but how's it going to affect me? And still, you take it. All those steps of faith that you had so that you could get better, we all go through. We walk into a room and we flick a switch believing the lights are going to come on. You go into your car and you turn the key believing that the car is going to start. You go and you sit in the chair believing it's going to hold your weight. You go driving and believing that everyone else is going to obey the rules of the road like you do, because you're putting your own risk into your life into their hands as you drive. And you go around roundabouts. And I still have problems with roundabouts. I do. I went around the other day and a car was honking at me, and I go, I know it, I did it wrong. I'm so thankful that He protects. You fill out something and you put it in the mail, believing that it's going to get from your house to where you want it to go. You have faith in all of these things. We all have faith. Well, here's the thing. Everyone has faith, but I want ever-increasing faith. And even as the lesson this morning that Herb said, faith is dreaming big dreams that if God doesn't come through, it's not going to happen. It's God-sized faith. That's what we want. D.L. Moody once had said, and he wrote, I prayed for faith, and I thought that it would come down and strike me like lightning. But faith didn't seem to come. One day I read in Romans that faith comes by hearing, and hearing from the Word of God. I had up to this time closed my Bible and prayed for faith. Now I open my Bible, I begin to study, and faith has been increasing ever since. That's where faith comes from. Biblical faith is a relationship with God. And that's what we want, an ever-increasing amount of. And that's what Hebrews chapter 11 is all about. Those that trusted, those that believed, those that took steps of faith, that walked where they didn't know where they were going to go. Anita had read in the very beginning, verse 1, and read along again as we begin here in chapter 11 of Hebrews. Now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. I had shared this in the 2020 New Testament Challenge, that faith it's active, it's present. It's not looking in the past, it's not living years ago, but it's right now. Faith is happening now. And if it's not, then we're missing out on what God wants to do. So faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. We're believing that something's going to happen in the future. What are we really believing? That God's going to come through, that God's going to keep His promise, that God's going to provide, that God is going to see us through, that God's going to open up a new door, that God is going to end this virus, that God is going to bring us to a new place because God does a brand new thing. That's what we're hoping for. We can't see it now, but we believe that God is able, and therefore we're walking. And that's what Abraham did. He went to a place that he had never been before, simply because God said, go and I will lead you. I have a land prepared for you. The Israelites were told there's a land flowing with milk and honey that will be yours. They've never seen it before. They've been in captivity for 400 years, but the promise is that you will have a land that is your own. And they believed it, and they went in to take possession of it, simply because God said it. And because God said it, they believed it, and they acted upon it. And that's what verse 1 is all about. Certain of what we do not see. Seeing is not believing, but believing is then being able to see. When you believe, your eyes are open, and then you can see things that you can't see naturally. And that's what God is wanting us to be all about. And that's what all of these were commended for. But notice what he says next. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. It begins in Genesis. The whole account of creation is that God worked. And that's our worldview. That's, as believers, what our focus should be upon. It's that God created. And it didn't happen through evolution, because God said it and then it was created. God spoke and things came to be. God did a miracle. I brought a couple things with me this morning, and I thought you might appreciate it. You know, creation is that there is a designer. Much like if you have your watch or your iPhone. That didn't just magically appear, or all these things put into a box and you shake them together and then, oh, look what popped out, an iPhone 10, or now it's coming up to 12. No, there was a designer that had something in mind, and then that was created. And you look at the world that we have, you look at your own body, it's perfect. It's so intricate. There had to have been a designer. But because there's a designer, that one day we're going to have to stand before that designer and give an account for what we did with our life. That's the belief of creation. Evolution, rather, is that there is no God, that everything happened by chance. It was all random, and because there is no God, then there is no accountability, so we can live our lives any way that we want. David Jeremiah once shared this, and I thought you might appreciate it. It's evolution from a monkey's perspective. 3 monkeys sat in a coconut tree, discussing things as they're said to be. Said one to the other, "Now you listen. That certain rumor, that just can't be true, that man descended from our noble race. Why, the very idea is a disgrace. No monkey ever deserted his wife, starved her babies, or ruined her life. And you've never heard of a mother monk to leave her babies with someone else to bunk, or pass them on from one another till they scarcely know who is their mother. And another thing, you'll never see a monk build a fence around his coconut tree, not letting the coconuts go to waste, and letting coconuts go to waste, forbidding all other monkeys a taste. Why, if I put a fence around that tree, starvation would force you to steal from me. And here's another thing a monk won't do. Get out at night and go on a stew, use a gun or a club or a knife, or take some other monkey's life. Yes, man descended that ornery cuss, but he sure didn't come from us." Ravi Zacharias was a great apologist, and he is now with the Lord. But I was listening on YouTube, and that's the great thing about the internet. You can go to YouTube and you can listen to all the things that he had said. And he was having a discussion once with someone that was, again, not believing in creation. And so he had this discussion. He said, "Now, let me get this straight, where you're coming from. You believe in evolution, and you believe in the atheist version of evolution." And he said, "Yes, I do." Well, there's 3 parts to it, as you know. There is time, and there is matter, and then there's chance. And you believe that if with enough time, matter, by chance, came up with life. And he said, "Yes, I do." Let's unpack that a little bit, he said. Time, it just like goes and goes and goes. It's forever time. And then you have matter, blah, 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 all these little matters going around. And so in all of time, all these little things eventually come up to you. And he said, "Yep, that's right." Well, there's a problem with that, because with that philosophy, there is no absolute truth. There is absolute truth that does not exist, because everything that you just mentioned is all random. And it's all in flux. There's nothing that's ever consistent. Time, it's always changing. Matter, it never stays the same. And then chance. Well, what is chance, he said? Chance is just the roll of the dice. It's a flip of the coin. It's you never know what you're going to get. It's just by chance. And so actually, it's nothing. And I said, and then Rabbi Zacharias said, I love the definition that Aristotle gave to nothing. It's what a rock dreams about. Think about that for a second. That's what nothing is. But that's what people have believed in. And it comes out with there is no absolute truth because everything is always in changing. So to say that that's what happened, by definition, it can't be, because that can't be absolute truth. So you have to be open to, well, there's got to be something else as a possibility. And he said what the other is that there is a God that is on the throne, that spoke everything into creation, that designed everything that we see. And when you look into the world, you see his handiwork. You look into the stars and you see God's handiwork. Creation is God's fingerprint. And then, when you think about what the Bible says of itself, Genesis, in the beginning, God created. But then God even reaffirmed it in Exodus chapter 20. When God was giving the 10 commandments, this is what it says. The first commandment is, you shall have no other gods before me. Number 2, you shall not make of yourselves an idol in the form of anything in heaven above or in the earth below. The third, you shall not misuse my name. We will not misuse the name of the Lord our God, for God will not hold anyone guiltless or misuses his name. Those are the first 3. And what's the fourth? The fourth commandment in the 10 commandments, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do your work. On the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. And on it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, your manservant or maidservant, nor your animals, no alien within your gates. In verse 11, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. In the 10 commandments, God wrote it in stone. Creation happened in 6 literal days. I believe it, because God can do miracles. And there's nothing that God cannot do. And if God speaks to create, then I believe that's exactly what he did. That in the Bible, he said what he meant, and he meant what he said. And so what do? We take it by faith, believing that God is able. So that's what he says in Hebrews chapter 11 at the very beginning. Continue on. As we now continue to go through, verse 4, by faith, Abel offered God a better sacrifice than Cain. He was commended as a righteous man. When you think about all of those that are listed here, it started with Abel. He honored God with blood and with obedience. An animal, as we talked last week, was killed to cover their sin. And so when you come into God's presence, sin has to be dealt with. And so what does Abel do? He brings a right sacrifice, a blood sacrifice. He obeyed what the Lord's command was, and he brought that which was acceptable, because sin can only be covered with blood. Abel, he believed what God did, and he honored God. Then, as you continue on, in verse 5, then you have Enoch. You read about Enoch in Genesis chapter 5. He was 65 years old when he became the father of Methuselah. And then he walked with God for 300 years. And then he just disappeared. He didn't die, but God just took him with him. For 65 years, he did what he wanted to do. He lived his life probably on his own terms. But then he became a father. And he probably held that little child in his hands. And he said, what do I do now? I need help. And so I need to go somewhere where I can find out, how do I raise this child? And so he started a relationship with God. And for 300 years, it says, he walked with God. What does it mean to walk with God? You listen to God and you do what he says. You spend time with him. You listen to him. You talk with him. You obey him. For 300 years, he got closer and closer to God because he spent time. He had a relationship with the God of the universe, the creator. And it was so close that God just said, I just want to, come on up home. It's time to go. He didn't die. He was just taken up. He walked by faith. He lived by faith. He was commended because he walked with God. So Abel, Enoch, and then Noah. What did Noah do? He built an ark. He and his family were the only ones righteous. Can you imagine the world in which he lived? How hostile it was to faith. How he was ridiculed. How he was belittled. How he was probably had great opposition, and people even made laws maybe against having anything to do with God. It was that kind of a world that he lived in, but he stood and he listened to God and he followed him. And God said, enough is enough. We're going to destroy everything with a flood, but you are going to build an ark. And so for year and year and year and year after year, he listened and he did what God told him to do, and he built an ark, even though he had never seen rain. Because at that point, there was a canopy of water over the earth, and there was dew, and so that's how the world was watered. And it wasn't until the flood came that the heavens were opened, and there was an outpouring of the water, and everything was covered. The highest mountain peaks were under water. But then the ark, with 2 by 2 animals inside the ark. Noah listened, and he believed, and he obeyed. Continue on. Then you have Abraham. Abraham, what did he do? He left his family and everything behind to go to a land that he had never seen. But he just heard what God said, and he followed God. And then God says, now look, everywhere you see, I'm going to give it to you. If you can see it, it's going to be yours. And then you're going to have a son. In your old age, you're going to have a son. And so what did Abraham do? When he was 100 years old, the angels came and said, you're going to have a son. Yes, I am. I'm going to be a dad. And my wife, Sarah, she's going to be a mom. Well, she was well advanced, and so she was laughing in the tent. And the angel said, why is she laughing? Is anything too hard for God? But Abraham believed God. Isaac was born. Then later, God said, I want you to sacrifice your son. As we read through chapter 11, he says, I'm going to have you sacrifice your son. And he believed that God would even bring him back from the dead, because God said that as many as the stars are in the sky, that's how many your descendants will be. As many as the sand is on the seashore, that's how many your descendants will be. But they're going to come through Isaac. But I want you to go sacrifice Isaac. He didn't understand. It didn't make sense naturally, but I believe God. And so he went to sacrifice his son, believing that God would raise him back from the dead. Abraham followed, even when he didn't understand. Continuing on, then you had Isaac. He blessed Jacob and Esau about their futures, not knowing what their future was going to be, but believed that what he was hearing God say and praying and blessing, that that's exactly what was going to happen to them. Then Joseph. Joseph was there, second in command over Egypt. He knew that one day the Israelites, they would become slaves, but there would be an exodus. And he said, when you leave, take my bones with you to go to the promised land. He didn't know when that was going to be. Who knew? He knew because God had placed that thought into his heart and into his mind, and he believed that that was going to happen, that God was going to keep his promise that he gave to Abraham so long ago, and I want to be a part of it. I'm not going to be there myself, but take my bones, because I know that God's faithful to his word. Continuing on, then you have Moses. Moses had all the opportunities, but he left them all behind to be mistreated with his people. And then, when they were leaving, the death angel was going to come. And God said, take the blood of the lamb, the lentils and the doorpost, and the death angel will pass over. And so he gave the command, believing that God was faithful to his word. And the death angel passed. And then there was the great exodus out of Egypt. The people, they walked through the Red Sea on dry ground. Later, Jericho, they marched around the city 7 times. What would have happened if they stopped at 6? They said, Sixth, we've already done a lot here. I think that's enough, don't you think? No, they followed to the very end. And then when they marched around on the seventh day, 7 times, they blew the trumpets. And what happened? The walls fell down. They simply listened to God and obeyed. They did what he said. And miracles happened. Rahab, the spies had gone into Jericho. Rather, the spies had gone in, and they wanted to scope out the land. She knew the story 40 years earlier, how God had brought them through the Red Sea. Now God has given you those kings. You defeated them. God's with you, and we don't know what to do. But I believe in your God. So if I protect you, will you protect my family? The spy said, if you put this scarlet cord in your window and your family is here in your house, you will be saved. 7 times around, the walls fell, and she and her family were safe because they trusted and they believed what they were told. She was a Gentile. She was a harlot, but she was brought into faith. Then Gideon, just mentioned his name, but we know the story. We can read all about it in Judges chapter 6. Gideon, you are a great warrior. Yeah, but look at everything that's happening around us. Why are you calling me a great warrior? If things are so wonderful, if God's on the throne, then why is all this happening? Because God's going to use you to deliver. Okay, I'll believe it. He struggled some, though. I'm going to put out a fleece and make it dry when everything else is wet. Okay, how about make it wet when everything else is dry? Okay, I will continue to follow. And then finally, you're going to battle, but you got too many men. So I want you to take them down, and whoever laps the water up like a dog, send them home. But whoever goes down on a knee and brings up the water and drinks it, still alert because of a battle and there's enemies all around, those you get to keep. Well, there's only 300 left. And now I'm going against this army with 300. God's able. And so they surround them. They break the light and they give the blast on the trumpets, and everything goes into confusion and they defeat themselves. God is able to do anything, even when it seems like we've got nothing or even just a little. God can do great with that. Then Barak, Judges chapter 4. Deborah comes to Barak and says, you're God's man. God's going to use you, so I need you to go and lead the armies. Well, I'm not going to go if you don't go. Okay. But then the glory's not going to go to you. It's going to go to a woman. Didn't matter to him. As long as he knew that God was with him through Deborah, then he would follow. And sure enough, they routed. Didn't care who got the glory, as long as God was with him. That's all that mattered. Then you've got Samson. Judges chapter 13. He blew it. We know the story of Samson. But at the end of his life, he was blind. He said, God, I did not take my gift seriously, but you've always been there. Would you fill me one more time with your Spirit? And then he pushed the columns apart, and the ceiling fell down, and more died then than ever before in his life. God gave him a second chance to be faithful. And it's like, yep, I've blown in the past, but God, you're the same yesterday, today, and forever. I'm going to trust you. Even though I've blown it before, I want to trust you now. And God used him. Then Jephthah, Judges chapter 11, you read about him. His wife, his mom was, it's a nice way to put it, a lady of the evening. And his dad was not respected. So everybody else in the whole area, they said, you're nothing. We're not going to listen to you. We don't want you even around here. But he was a great warrior. He had skills. And then when the enemy came to attack, they said, what are we going to do? Let's go to Jephthah and see if he'll help us. And so they go and they say, if you will help us out, if you will lead us, then we will allow you to be over us. You will be our leader, not only in battle, but afterward as well. And he said, if God wills it, then I will. If I sense that God is leading me, I will do it. And so God pressed upon him. That's what he was to do. So he forgave all of those that had been so nasty to him, that had rejected him, and he prayed for them. And God used Jephthah and routed the enemy, and then he was their leader. And he was a good leader because he was following God. Because he knew that God would take care of him when everybody else turned their back on him. That God was faithful when everybody else was bad. That God was good all the time. Then David, we know all about David. He had his ups and his downs. When you read the Psalms, it's kind of like a roller coaster. He's really high and he's really low, and he's really high and he's really low, and he's great in faith, and then he blows it big time. He's not perfect, but he had a heart after God. And what did that mean? It meant that he knew that God was good. And even when he held back and he didn't confess his sin, and his strength was zapped in the heat of the day, and his pillow was wet with his tears at night because he knew there was so much guilt for his sin when he didn't deal with it, he knew that if he would simply surrender to God, that God was good. Yes, there's consequences, but I would much rather fall into the hands of God than the hands of men. And so he was a heart after God. What did that mean? It meant that he was willing to surrender and to submit to God, to trust God even in difficulties, when he was on the run from others and when he was running from himself. God was still good, and God was worthy, and so he trusted. When you look at all of these men, when you look at all of those that lived by faith, it's a great cloud of witnesses. It's those that are saying, even now, don't quit. Don't give up. Don't shrink back. Keep on believing. Keep on trusting. Keep on pursuing. Keep praising, and keep worshiping God. That's what chapter 11 is all about. It's not just looking into the past, but learning from the past so that we would know what to do in the present. And there's 4 things I want to mention as we close. What is it that God wants us to know right now from chapter 11? First is that God allows his people to face impossible situations. All of those that were leading by faith, that were walking by faith, life was not a cakewalk. Life was difficult, and it was hard, and it was uncertain, and it was oppressive, and there were problems everywhere you looked, and there was uncertainty, and they blew it time and time again. They weren't perfect. God allowed them to go through impossible situations because they needed to know something, that God was able, that God was worthy, and that God can see them through. The second, trust God's purpose. God has a purpose in all things. He allows things into our life so that we might trust him more. Another way to put it, faith does not get rid of problems, but faith in the midst of problems sees us through. And so God has a purpose. He allows difficulties to come so we would know how good he is, how powerful he is, and who we can be in him. We can be victorious because he wears the victor's crown. When we have our faith and trust in him, anything is possible. That's what chapter 11 is all about. The third thing, obey God's instructions. In all of those that we just went through, God was speaking, and they were listening. Again, it's kind of my catchphrase, but it's the phrase of the Bible. Listen to God and do what he says, and things will turn out the way they should. It doesn't mean that it's always going to be perfect, but we're going to know that God's hand was in it, and he has something that he's doing in the big picture. And God doesn't just work in a moment, but God works generations. And what we're going through, it might not be about us. It could be about our kids or our grandkids or children yet to be born, because there's a great cloud of witnesses that we can be a part of that will be leading them. And then the fourth, believe in God's ability. Every single one of those ancients that were commended for their faith, there was difficulties and there were problems. In fact, as you read through the latter part of chapter 11, it says that they were looking for a city, not their own. Some, they had great opportunities. They had great successes. But others, they were put in prison. They were killed. They were having their stuff confiscated. But they were still walking by faith. So the outcome, God doesn't see it the same way we do. We look at, if we've got victory every time, God's with us. If it's bad and things go from bad to worse, God might not be with us. But God doesn't see it that way. He says, are your eyes upon me? Are you trusting me? You might even lose your life, but are you faithful to the end? One day when we stand before, as Herb had mentioned, it's not about, well thought, but it's well done, my good and faithful servant. That's what Hebrews chapter 11 is all about. And that's what God is speaking to us about today. That He is able, no matter what the situation. There's a song I want you to listen to now. And it's about faith and the call that God would raise up increased faith in each and every one of us. Because that's what God is looking for. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. I want to please God. I know you do, but it means walking by faith. Caleb, if you'd play that song.